Stop what you're doing right now and look at Moscow, because Ukraine has just sent Putin a message that no amount of Kremlin propaganda can hide. Russia brought fire to Kyiv. Ukraine brought fire back to Moscow. And this was not some random explosion in the distance. This was not a small border incident. This was not a symbolic attack on an empty field. Ukrainian drones reportedly struck one of Moscow's most important oil facilities, deep inside the Russian capital's own security bubble, close enough to the Kremlin to make every official in Moscow understand exactly what this means. The war is no longer something Putin can keep safely away from the Russian capital. The war is no longer only a television event for Russians to watch from a distance. The war is coming back to the system that started it. And that is why this strike matters. Not because one refinery fire ends the war. Not because one explosion destroys Russia. Not because Moscow suddenly collapses overnight. But because Ukraine has found a way to hit Putin where it hurts. His image, his economy, his fuel system, his air defense narrative, and the illusion that Russia can attack Ukrainian cities without consequences at home. That illusion just went up in smoke. The target was the Moscow oil refinery, also known as the Kyiv refinery. It sits in southeast Moscow, not far from the heart of Russian power. This is not some distant refinery in a remote industrial zone near the border. This is a major fuel facility inside Russia's capital region, close enough to the Kremlin that the symbolism is impossible to miss. Ukraine did not need to hit the Kremlin itself. It hit the war machine beside it. That is the key. Russia has spent years launching missiles and drones into Ukrainian cities. Kyiv has endured waves of attacks. Ukrainian civilians have watched apartment blocks, energy sites, schools, churches, and cultural landmarks come under fire. Moscow has tried to make terror from the sky feel normal for Ukraine. Now Ukraine is showing Moscow that distance is not protection. If Russia can strike Kyiv, Ukraine can strike the infrastructure that fuels Russia's war. That is the message, and the timing makes it even more powerful. The Moscow refinery attack came after another wave of Russian strikes on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine framed its campaign against Russian oil infrastructure as a military response to the machinery that funds, fuels, and sustains Putin's invasion. This is not about targeting civilians. This is about hitting the economic bloodstream of Russia's war effort. Oil is not just oil in this war. Fuel is movement. Fuel is logistics. Fuel is military transport. Fuel is the trucks that carry shells. Fuel is the generators that power bases. Fuel is the money that helps Putin keep the war going. So when Ukraine hits a refinery, it is not just creating a fire. It is attacking the system behind the invasion. That is why Moscow should be worried. For years, Putin built his war on a simple assumption. He believed Russia could impose pain on Ukraine while shielding ordinary Russians from the full reality of the conflict. He believed Ukrainian cities could burn while Moscow remained stable. He believed Russian missiles could strike Kyiv while Moscow's own strategic infrastructure remained protected. Ukraine is now challenging that belief. The explosion at the refinery did more than send smoke into the sky. It sent a warning through Russia's political system. If Ukraine can hit this refinery once, it can try again. If Ukraine can reach Moscow's fuel infrastructure, it can reach other critical nodes. If Russian air defenses cannot fully protect a refinery this close to the Kremlin, then what exactly can they guarantee? That question is now sitting inside every Russian security meeting. And it is an ugly question for Putin, because Putin's image depends on control. He presents himself as the man who protects Russia, the man who restores power, the man who keeps enemies away from the gates, the man who can threaten others while remaining untouchable. But a refinery fire in Moscow tells a different story. It tells Russians that the war is not safely contained. It tells Russian elites that Ukrainian drones are not just battlefield tools. It tells military planners that the capital's defenses can be pressured. It tells fuel suppliers that their infrastructure is now part of the battlefield. And it tells Putin that Ukraine is no longer waiting passively for the next Russian strike. Ukraine is answering. This is where the revenge frame becomes so powerful. The message is simple. This is for Kyiv. That works because everyone understands the emotional logic in 1 second. Kyiv has been hit again and again. Ukraine has absorbed terror from the sky for years. Russia wanted Ukrainian civilians to feel helpless beneath missiles and drones. Now Ukraine is using its own long-range capabilities to make Russia's war economy feel vulnerable. This is not revenge in the reckless sense. It is strategic retaliation. Ukraine is not simply saying, "You hit us, so we hit you." Ukraine is saying, "You depend on oil and fuel to continue this invasion, so we will target the system that keeps your invasion alive." That is a much more dangerous message for Moscow. Because Russia can dismiss one explosion as an accident, one drone as a failure, one fire as a temporary incident. But when the same kind of infrastructure is hit repeatedly across different regions, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Ukraine is building a fuel war against refineries, a war against depots, a war against oil terminals, a war against the logistics chain that turns Russian energy into Russian military power. And Moscow is now inside that war. That is why the Kyiv strike matters more than its flames. This refinery is not only a piece of industrial infrastructure. It is part of the capital's energy network. It is connected to civilian fuel supply, military logistics, industrial planning, and the psychological stability of Moscow itself. When smoke rises from a facility like that, people notice. Videos spread. Rumors spread. Panic spreads. Officials try to explain. Propagandists try to control the narrative. But the image is already out. Moscow burned. That is the kind of image Putin cannot easily erase. And there's another problem for Russia. The more Ukraine targets refineries, the more Russia has to defend them. That sounds simple, but it is a nightmare on a map. Russia is the largest country on Earth. It has refineries, depots, pipelines, ports, air bases, railway hubs, ammunition storage sites, factories, and command centers spread across enormous distances. Ukraine does not need to attack all of them at once. It only needs to force Russia to worry that many of them could be next. That creates pressure. Russia has to move air defenses. Russia has to protect fuel facilities. Russia has to respond to public panic. Russia has to repair damaged units. Russia has to keep fuel flowing. Russia has to keep the army supplied. Russia has to stop prices from spiraling. Russia has to reassure the capital. Ukraine has to keep finding weak points. That is asymmetric warfare. Russia's size becomes a burden because every critical node needs protection. Every air defense system guarding a refinery is an air defense system not guarding something else. Every repair team sent to an oil facility is not fixing another military site. Every drone alert forces Moscow to make choices it did not want to make. This is how Ukraine turns drones into strategic pressure. A single drone is cheap compared to a refinery unit. A single strike can force expensive repairs. A single explosion can interrupt production. A single fire can cause market anxiety. A single attack near Moscow can damage Putin's image. That is the equation Ukraine wants. Cheap pressure against expensive systems. And Russia is struggling to solve it. For years, Russia had the luxury of depth. Moscow could launch strikes from far away. It could rely on distance, size, and layered defenses. But the drone age has changed the meaning of distance. A facility hundreds of kilometers from Ukraine is no longer automatically safe. A capital region is no longer immune. A refinery close to the Kremlin is no longer beyond reach. That is a fundamental shift. Russia can still shoot down drones. Russia can still jam them. Russia can still claim it repelled attacks. Russia can still minimize damage. But it cannot guarantee that every drone will fail. And when the target is a refinery, one drone getting through can be enough to create a massive problem. That is why Ukrainian long-range drone development is so important. Ukraine has spent years turning necessity into innovation. It did not have the luxury of a massive air force capable of bombing Russian infrastructure in a traditional way. So it built another path. It developed long-range drones. It improved production. It adapted designs. It learned how to hit deeper. It learned how to create pressure without matching Russia plane for plane or missile for missile. That adaptation is now changing the war. Russia expected Ukraine to run out. Instead, Ukraine started building new ways to reach Russia. Russia expected the battlefield to stay mostly inside Ukraine. Instead, Ukraine is making Russian infrastructure part of the battlefield. Russia expected Moscow to remain a protected center. Instead, a refinery near Moscow is burning. That is why Putin should be furious, because this attack exposes multiple failures at once. First, it exposes an air defense failure. Moscow is one of the most defended cities in Russia. The capital is politically sensitive, militarily important, and symbolically sacred to the Kremlin. If drones can reach a major refinery in the Moscow area, then Russian air defense commanders have a problem they cannot solve with slogans. Second, it exposes an intelligence failure. Ukraine had to know what to hit, where to hit, and how to reach the target. That suggests planning, surveillance, route selection, and a growing understanding of Russian vulnerabilities. Third, it exposes an economic failure. Russia's fuel system is not just a civilian convenience. It is connected to the war. Damage to refining capacity, even temporary damage, adds pressure to supplies, pricing, and logistics. Fourth, it exposes a political failure. Putin promised Russian security through strength. But the longer the war continues, the more the war reaches back into Russia itself. That is the real humiliation. Putin wanted Ukraine to feel unsafe. Now Russians in Moscow are watching smoke from a war they were told was under control. And the psychological effect matters. Imagine being a Russian citizen in Moscow. For years, state television has told you that Russia is strong, Ukraine is weak, the West is failing, and victory is inevitable. Then drones arrive. Flights are disrupted. Smoke rises. Videos appear online. Officials tell people everything is under control. But you can see the black smoke. You can hear the blast. You can see the traffic disruption. You can watch the refinery burn. At some point, the propaganda and the reality stop matching. That does not mean Russians immediately revolt, but creates doubt. And doubt is dangerous for authoritarian systems. Putin's system depends on confidence. Not love. Not truth. Confidence. The belief that the state is powerful, that resistance is useless, that the leader knows what he is doing, and that the war is being managed. Every Ukrainian strike on a high-profile target chips away at that confidence. A refinery strike near Moscow says the state can be surprised. A second strike in 3 days says the problem is not solved. A visible fire says the damage cannot be hidden. That is why this story has such powerful YouTube energy. It has everything. A famous city, a massive explosion, a target connected to the war economy, a revenge frame after attacks on Kyiv, a weakness in Russian air defenses, a direct hit on Putin's image, and a future threat. If Ukraine can do this once, what comes next? That is the open loop, because Ukraine's drone campaign is not ending here. In fact, the Moscow refinery strike appears to be part of a much wider strategy. Ukraine has repeatedly targeted Russian oil and fuel infrastructure because it understands that Russia's invasion needs more than soldiers. It needs refined fuel. It needs revenue. It needs distribution. It needs internal stability. It needs Moscow to believe the war remains manageable. Ukraine is attacking all of those needs at the same time. This is why Russia's response is so difficult. If Moscow escalates against Ukrainian cities, Ukraine can argue that its strikes on Russian war infrastructure are a justified answer to Russian terror. If Russia moves more air defenses to Moscow, other regions become less protected. If Russia hides damage, videos leak. If Russia admits damage, panic grows. If Russia tries to repair quickly, Ukraine may strike again. Every option carries a cost. That is what Ukraine wants. Not one perfect victory, a permanent dilemma. Ukraine's strike near Moscow is bigger than one refinery fire. It attacks Putin's biggest assumption, that Russia can simply outlast Ukraine. Putin believes time is on his side. But Ukraine is making every month of war more expensive for Russia. More drones, more damaged infrastructure, more refinery fires, more air defense pressure, and more anxiety inside Russian cities. This is Ukraine's strategy now, not just fighting at the front, but weakening the system behind it. Russia needs fuel, depots, ports, airfields, logistics, and safe rear areas. Ukraine is making those targets vulnerable. The message is simple. Russia wanted Ukraine to live under constant threat. Now Ukraine is making Russia's war machine live under constant threat. That is why this strike matters. It shows Moscow is not untouchable. It boosts Ukrainian morale, damages Russia's confidence, and warns Putin that the longer this war continues, the more costly it becomes for Russia itself. For Russia, it is anxiety. And in a long war, morale and anxiety matter. A country that believes it can strike back keeps fighting. A regime that fears the next strike starts overreacting. That overreaction can create more problems for Russia. More restrictions, more air defense redeployments, more panic buying, more pressure on fuel retailers, more security around infrastructure, more censorship, more visible signs that the war is not going according to plan. Ukraine wants Russia to live inside that pressure, because pressure changes behavior. It forces mistakes. It drains resources. It weakens confidence. And eventually, it can shape the battlefield. The refinery fire in Moscow will not win the war by itself, but it belongs to the kind of campaign that can change the cost of the war. If Ukraine keeps hitting oil infrastructure, Russia has to pay for repairs, absorb supply disruption, defend more sites, and explain more failures. If the attacks become regular, they stop being shocking events and become a strategic burden. That is when the real damage begins. The first strike creates fear. The repeated strikes create exhaustion. And exhaustion is what Putin wanted Ukraine to feel. Now Ukraine is sending some of it back. That is why this moment matters. Russia thought it could terrorize Kyiv and keep Moscow calm. Ukraine just showed that Moscow can burn too. Russia thought its oil infrastructure was the engine of the war. Ukraine just showed that engine can be hit. Putin thought distance protected his capital. Ukraine just showed distance is not enough. And the next phase may be even more dangerous for the Kremlin, because Ukraine's long-range drone program is not moving backward. It is expanding. Its operators are learning. Its manufacturers are adapting. Its target lists are growing. Its ability to combine intelligence, production, and strike planning is improving. If Moscow was shocked by one refinery fire, what happens when Ukraine can launch more drones, more often, and more targets across more of Russia? That is the question Putin now has to answer. And it is not a comfortable question, because the answer may be that Russia's war economy is no longer safely behind the front. It is part of the front. The refinery is part of the front. The fuel depot is part of the front. The pipeline is part of the front. The airbase is part of the front. The factory is part of the front. And Moscow itself is no longer beyond the reach of the war Putin started. That is the real meaning of the explosion. It was not just fire. It was a warning. A warning that Kyiv is no longer only absorbing Russian attacks. A warning that Ukraine's drones are turning Russia's depth into Russia's weakness. A warning that Putin's capital cannot be fully sealed off from the consequences of his invasion. And a warning that the more Russia attacks Ukraine, the more Ukraine will hunt the systems that keep Russia's war alive. This was for Kyiv, but it was also for Moscow. A message delivered in smoke, fire, and panic. The war came from the Kremlin. Now the war is finding its way back.